All right, so put yourself there. I need you to actually, like, physically imagine the reality of this.
Yeah.
You were in the Soviet Union. It is 1927. The dust from the Russian Civil War has barely settled. You've got absolutely zero modern technology, no CGI, obviously, no digital safety nets, no weather apps, no lightweight synthetic beer. And this director decides to drag an entire film crew into the literal, unforgiving desert to pull off what I can only describe as an absolute cinematic miracle. I mean, it is a completely lost masterpiece, an epic of...
Wait. Stop right there. Hold on a second. I have to interrupt this absurd romantic fantasy you were building before you get entirely carried away.
I am setting the scene. I am putting the listener in the geographical context.
You are setting a trap is what you're doing. Look, let's address the massive, glaring paradox right out of the gate here. If this film is the sheer miracle you say it is, if it contains arguably some of the most influential visual choices in cinema history, as you keep insisting off air, why has practically nobody listening to this ever actually heard of it? Because let's be brutally honest, mate, I'm looking at the exact same source of material you are, and I reckon it might just be a massive fluke. Or worse, an absolute shambles that just happened to survive the Soviet archives by pure blind luck.
Are you joking? A shambles. I will be completely honest with you and with you listening right now.
Cinema, the magic vehicle, a comprehensive guide. Journey 1, 1913 to 1950.
When I first dug into this week's subject, this 1927 silent film called The 41st, or Sorok Pervy, if we are being precise, I was completely gobsmacked. I genuinely was. I went in expecting some dusty, impenetrable historical artifact, the sort of thing you endure in a university lecture rather than actually watch. And I came in, well, it kept me up at night. The sheer rawness of it. The unadulterated scale of what they were attempting when the medium of cinema was still basically in its infancy. It's a properly genius.
See, you say it kept you up like it was some profound spiritual awakening. It kept me up too, mate, but mostly out of pure frustration at how unbelievably dodgy some of the filmmaking is compared to what we expect today. You are looking at this through these incredibly thick, rose-tinted historical glasses. You're forgiving its massive flaws because it's old.
I'm looking at it in its proper context.
Context doesn't make a boring, static shot suddenly thrilling. I mean, I was tearing my hair out at some of the directorial choices. You can't just point to the calendar and say, oh, it was 1927, and pretend the pacing isn't absolutely glacial.
That's rubbish, mate. You are completely missing the point of what they were achieving. And look, to the person listening to us right now, the third person at this table, stick with us. Because I promise you, once we unpack the absolute behind-the-scenes madness of this specific film, the techniques they practically invented out of thin air, and the brutal conditions they survived, it is going to entirely change how you view modern cinema. Every time you see a massive desert epic, every time you watch a raw, gritty war film, you're going to think of the groundwork laid by the 41st.
Or more likely, you'll just be deeply grateful that modern directors actually know how to pace a narrative so you don't fall asleep in your popcorn. But fine. Let's get into the man responsible for this miracle, as you so generously call it. The director, Yakov Protazanov.
Yes, Protazanov. Okay, let's unpack this properly, because you cannot understand this film without understanding the absolute force of nature that was its director. Born in 1881. I want to linger on that date because this is absolutely crucial. It means he wasn't some young, fiery, radicalized revolutionary kid when he made this film in the late 1920s. He was a grown man. He was already a leading, highly established film director back in Tsarist Russia before the Bolsheviks even took power.
Exactly my point. He was a relic. He belonged to a dead empire.
Hear me out. He specialized in adaptations of literary classics. He worked almost exclusively with classical theatrical actors. And the source text makes it very clear. He was a true, dyed-in-the-wool professional. The man was astonishingly flexible. Think about what it takes to survive the complete and utter collapse of an empire, the bloody chaos of the Russian Revolution, emigrate to Europe, come back, and somehow pivot from making polite Tsarist theatrical adaptations to futuristic sci-fi fantasies like Alita and even folk comedies. In the 1910s, Russian cinema was completely primitive. A total wild west of people just figuring out where to point the lens. Yet he forged a path. He is the definition of a pioneer.
You can't be serious. A pioneer. Did we read the same book?
The text we're drawing from explicitly says that the 1920s Soviet cinema scene was completely unsuitable for his skills. The entire avant-garde movement of the 20s, which was entirely preoccupied with rapid editing and montage, the stuff that was actually pushing the medium of film forward into a new art form, was alien to him. He wasn't a pioneer. He was a dinosaur who couldn't keep up with the times. He wasn't trying to keep up. He was actively doing something different. He was resisting a trend.
He was stuck in the past. He came under incredibly heady fire from contemporary critics for his traditionalism and his so-called bourgeois mentality. And frankly, when you watch the film, you can see exactly why they went after him. His theatrical approach was a massive liability. When you watch his silent films, they don't feel like cinema. They feel staged. They feel completely stagnant. He is taking stage actors who have a totally different over-the-top approach to physical expression, and he is plonking them in front of a camera and expecting it to work exactly like a proscenium arch in a theater. It is a different medium, and he didn't grasp the mechanics of it.
All right, I need to jump in here because we are throwing around the term montage and the phrase bourgeois mentality without actually explaining the mechanics and the stakes of what we were talking about.
Right.
Let's start with the editing, the montage. You're criticizing him for not using it, but we have to explain how that Soviet montage theory actually worked mechanically to manipulate psychology and why Protazanov's theatrical wide shots were the direct mechanical opposite of this.
Right, fine. Let's explain the mechanics, because it proves my point entirely. The young Soviet directors in the 1920s, people like Sergei Eisenstein and Lev Kuleshov, they realized that film isn't theater. In theater, the actor generates the emotion on stage in real time. In film, these young directors figured out that the editor generates the emotion in the cutting room.
The Kuleshov effect.
The Kuleshov effect, for you listening if you don't know this, it is basically the foundational theory of film editing. Kuleshov took a shot of an actor with a completely blank, expressionless face, just staring. He then cut that shot together with 3 different things. First, he cuts from the blank face to a bowl of soup. Audiences watched it and said, wow, that actor looks incredibly hungry. Then he takes the exact same blank face and cuts to a child in a coffin. Audiences say, my God, the profound sorrow on his face. Then he cuts the same blank face to a beautiful woman on a sofa. Audiences say, look at the lust in his eyes.
Which is mental, because it's the exact same piece of film of the actor's face.
Exactly. The emotion doesn't exist in the performance at all. It exists in the collision of the 2 shots. That is montage. You are building emotion mechanically in the edit room. You are forcing the audience's brain to connect A and B to create C. It was revolutionary. It was dynamic. It was the birth of modern cinematic language.
Right, and Protazanov didn't do this.
No. Protazanov locked his massive, heavy camera down on a tripod, framed the shot wide so you could see everyone's feet like you were sitting in the stalls at a theater, and he demanded the actors perform the emotion in real time. He entirely ignored the greatest mechanical breakthrough in cinematic history because he was a theatrical dinosaur.
But that is exactly what makes his survival and his ultimate success so incredible. Yes, the 1920s avant-garde directors were all obsessed with cutting-edge montage, chopping up film into tiny, frenetic visual rhythms. And yes, Protazanov gets hammered by the critics for being a traditionalist. But we need to pause on that phrase he used earlier, bourgeois mentality. Because to a modern listener, getting slammed by critics for being bourgeois sounds like, I don't know, getting a bad review on Letterboxd. It sounds like someone calling your film a bit posh or old-fashioned.
It was a bit more serious than that.
It was literal life or death. In 1927 Soviet Russia, the state is consolidating power. The secret police, the Chekas, are actively monitoring art. If you're accused of having a bourgeois mentality, meaning you sympathize with the old capitalist, czarist ways, the very people the revolution just slaughtered, that is politically dangerous. You could easily lose your career, you could lose your freedom, you could end up in a gulag or face a firing squad. And we weren't taking a stance on the politics here, just reporting what the sources say the historical reality was. The fact that Protazanov was making this raw, morally ambiguous romance relying on traditional methods instead of towing the line with pristine, hyper-edited communist propaganda, that was an incredibly high-wire act.
Oh, come on. You were making him sound like some rogue artistic freedom fighter.
He was taking a massive risk. Think about what that means for a second. Is adapting to every single new technological fad-like montage the only mark of true genius? Or is there something profound to be said for a traditionalist who sticks to his guns, who understands the fundamental ancient mechanics of storytelling and manages to outlast the political chaos? Because I argue that his traditionalism, his reliance on real performance rather than editing tricks, actually makes the 41st feel far more authentic than the hyper-edited propaganda pieces of the same era.
Look, mate, I get the romantic appeal of the stubborn old master narrative. It plays well in the history books. But let's be fiercely practical here. If you're a director in the 1920s and the entire cinematic language is rapidly evolving around you and you literally do not possess the skills to utilize the new editing techniques, you aren't making a brave, principled, artistic choice. You're just fundamentally limited by your own incompetence. He wasn't choosing not to use montage to make a profound statement. He just didn't get it. He didn't understand the math of it.
I completely disagree. I think he found a script that perfectly matched his traditional strengths, and he used his limitations to his advantage. The film is based on a brilliant short story by Boris Lavrinov. It was adapted by Lavrinov himself alongside Boris Leonidov, and Protazanov knew exactly how to handle that specific material because it is a story about isolation. He wasn't relying on flashy editing tricks because the story didn't need them. He was relying on raw, undeniable physical reality. Which brings us, logically, to how he actually shot this film. Because he was a traditionalist who refused to build a movie in the editing room, he had to rely entirely on what the camera could actually see in front of the lens. He needed an immense physical scale. And that absolute necessity is what drove him out of the safety of a Moscow studio and into the literal hell of the Karakum Desert. Whatever you think of his pedigree, you cannot deny the absolute visual triumph of the setting.
Oh, here we go. The raw reality defense. I was waiting for this.
It is breathtaking. We have photography by Pyotr Yermolov and art direction by Sergei Kozlovsky. And they didn't just build a nice little sandbox set in a backlot in Moscow, paint a backdrop, and point a fan at the actors. They physically went to the Karakum Desert in Central Asia. They went to a remote Turkmen village on the Aral Sea. Do you understand the logistics of that in 1927? This film is so raw, it practically borders on documentary footage.
Right, close to a documentary. Which, let's be honest, in the context of narrative cinema, is very often just a polite, critical way of saying it completely lacks narrative drive.
You're being deliberately cynical. Just picture the crossing of the Karakum Desert sequence. The sandstorm. The details of the scenery aren't just there to look pretty on a postcard. They actively amplify the drama of the character's survival. You can practically feel the grit in the actor's teeth. You can feel the blistering heat radiating off the orthochromatic film stock.
Wait, hold on. Let's actually talk about that film stock and the cameras, because this plays right into why I think the film is a slog. We need to explain why the pacing is so slow. It's not just a stylistic choice.
It's an atmospheric choice.
It's a mechanical limitation.
Yeah.
Look, the cameras they were using in 1927 were essentially massive, heavy wooden boxes filled with brass gears. They were hand-cranked. They weighed an absolute ton. You couldn't just throw one on your shoulder and do a dynamic run through the dunes. If you drag one of those beasts into the deep sand of the Karakum Desert, you set it down on a heavy wooden tripod, and it stays there. Because if you try to move it, the sand gets into the gears, the hand crank seizes up, the incredibly volatile nitrate film stock practically melts in the heat, and the entire production shuts down.
Exactly, they were battling the elements.
Yes, but my point is that the static wide shots aren't necessarily a stroke of theatrical genius. They are a byproduct of the fact that the camera was literally too heavy to move in the sand. You say the scenery isn't ornamental, but I'm looking at these seemingly endless, sweeping shots of people walking very, very slowly from the left side of the frame to the right side of the frame, and I'm thinking, this is a massive slog.
That limitation created the aesthetic of isolation. Protazanov turned that technical bug into a feature. By locking the camera down and forcing us to watch these tiny human figures struggle against this vast, immovable landscape, he emphasizes their insignificance. It grounds the story in harsh reality.
It grounds it in a complete halt. Look, this is a massive problem with how we view historical cinema today. There is this overwhelming, pretentious tendency among film historians to romanticize physical suffering on a film set as high art. Oh, the crew nearly died of dehydration in a real sandstorm, so it must be a masterpiece. No, it might just be terrible logistical planning by an arrogant director. Just because a shoot in an actual sandstorm was physically torturous for everyone involved, it doesn't automatically translate into a gripping watch for a modern audience sitting in a comfortable chair.
But the suffering on screen isn't fake. And look at how brave the aesthetic choices are regarding the characters themselves. We have to contrast this with what came later. In the 1930s, when Stalin really clamped down on the arts, Soviet cinema became entirely dominated by this mythological socialist realism, the hero worship. You get films like Chapayev or the Maxim trilogy, where the Red Army soldiers are depicted as these pristine, idealized supermen. Their uniforms are clean, their morals are pure, they never make mistakes. But here, in 1927, Protazanov shows the Red Guards as they actually were during the Civil War. primitive, shabby, exhausted, completely undisciplined. They look like they haven't bathed in months because they haven't. It is a stunningly brave, raw choice, contrary to all the propaganda the state wanted.
Brave, or just miserable to look at. Honestly, mate, if I have to watch another 10-minute sequence of a shabby bloke staring blankly at a camel, I mean, you cannot excuse a bloated runtime just because the costumes were historically accurate. The extensive desert episodes are tedious, period.
But the suffering is the entire point of the narrative. The characters are suffering. It is not just a backdrop. The desert is an active antagonist in the story. And you have to remember the historical timeline. This was made in 1927, barely a decade after the actual events of the Russian Civil War in that region. The wounds were fresh. The memory of the real Red Guards fighting the White Army in Central Asia was a lived reality for the audience. That raw, unpolished documentary feel is exactly why this silent version feels so much more true than anything that came after it in the 30s.
I will concede that it is historically fascinating as a document of the era. But true does not equal entertaining, and true certainly doesn't excuse fundamentally sloppy storytelling when it comes to the actual plot.
Okay, let's transition right there. Let's talk about the storytelling. Because if you think the plot is sloppy, we're watching two different movies. This is where the genius of the film really locks into place for me. The core premise is an incredibly tight, inescapable moral trap.
It's basically a 20s soap opera set in a very large sandbox.
It is a masterclass in psychological tension. Let's lay it out for the listener. We have our protagonist, Mariutka, played absolutely brilliantly by Ada Wojcik. She is not some fragile maiden. She is a hardened, lethal, Red Guard woman soldier. A sniper, essentially. In fact, the title of the 41st refers to her kill count. She has killed 40 White Army enemies, and she is tasked with guarding a captured, wounded counter-revolutionary officer, Lieutenant Gavruka Otrok, played by Ivan Kovas-Emborski. He is an aristocrat, an intellectual, the very embodiment of the bourgeois enemy she is fighting against. They are stranded together. And over time, as they are forced to rely on each other to survive the elements, she inevitably falls in love with him. He becomes the 41st man in her life, but in a completely different way.
Right. So enemies to lovers, groundbreaking.
Put yourself in her shoes. It is the ultimate what would you do scenario. You have this intense pressure cooker collision of guilt, lust, political ideology, duty to the revolution, and raw human power dynamics, all happening in total geographical isolation. We've got the commissar, played by Ivan Stroh, adding to the pressure earlier on. And what I love is Protazanov's directness in handling this. The source material notes this specifically. He doesn't attempt to be overly poetic or pretentious with the romance. He tells the story with absolute narrative economy.
Economy? Are you joking? He dragged the audience across a featureless desert for 20 minutes of screen time just to establish they were thirsty.
Narrative economy, regarding their internal state. The text explicitly points out that there is a distinct lack of deep psychological characterization, but that it is completely offset by the rich, precise observation of the background and the environment. He strips away all the melodramatic inner monologues that other directors would use. He doesn't give us title cards explaining your feelings. He just shows you two desperate human beings operating purely on necessity and instinct. It is brilliant.
You can't be serious. Brilliant. You are completely, willfully ignoring the massive elephant in the room here. The finale.
A finale is tragic. It's the scale of a Greek tragedy.
The finale is a complete, unmitigated directorial shambles. And we need to explain why it's a shambles, mechanically speaking, for a silent film. Let's look at exactly what the source text says. It explicitly states that in the finale, Protazanov literally could not logically justify the events of the plot. He paints himself into a narrative corner where the political reality and the romantic reality collide, and instead of actually directing his way out of it through action or pacing, he just throws his hands in the air and dumps the entire burden onto the shoulders of his lead actress.
He gave her a complex, culminating emotional beat. That is what directors do.
He gave her an impossible task. We have to explain the mechanics of silent acting here to understand why this is so egregious. Silent film acting relied on broad physical pantomime. It relied on melodrama. Because you don't have spoken dialogue, you have to convey emotion with your entire body. Big gestures for anger, weeping for sadness. Now look at what Protazanov asks Ada Wojcik to portray simultaneously in a single silent shot, mind you. Happiness at the arrival of rescue, anger at the lieutenant's triumph, despair when he is shot, and dignified pride when facing the hated enemy. All at once. It is mental.
It's the human condition.
It is mechanically impossible in the medium. Asking a silent film actress to convey nuanced happiness, anger, despair, and pride all at the exact same moment without speaking a single word is like asking a pianist to play a frantic Beethoven sonata and a gentle Chopin waltz at the exact same time with one hand. It just results in noise. You cannot physically convey four distinct, contradictory impulses simultaneously in a pantomime medium without looking absolutely ridiculous. It's a total failure of direction. Protazanov tried to force a 1950s method-acting psychological beat into a 1920s pantomime medium, and it falls flat on its face.
I completely reject that. I reject the idea that silent film actors were just clowns doing broad gestures. It is the height of human complexity. Have you never in your life felt two completely opposing emotions at once? Have you never felt bittersweet joy?
Two emotions, maybe. I can manage bittersweet. But not four completely distinct politically and romantically charged states of being while standing silently on a beach. It is absurd. Yeah. It is the director throwing his hands in the air and saying, right, I don't know how to resolve the clash between Bolshevik duty and bourgeois romance logically, so just look really, really conflicted, love. We'll fix it in the, oh, wait, we don't edit.
But the primary source text itself says, this drawback isn't too important in the grand scheme of things. It explicitly argues that it doesn't detract from the overall monumental achievements of the actors. And frankly, the fact that Ada Wojcik pulls it off at all, that she conveys even a fraction of that internal war, is a testament to the fact that Protazanov, despite his theatrical roots, knew exactly how to cast brilliant performers and trust them to deliver.
I think you're letting him off the hook massively, and history proves my point. Let's just fast forward a bit to prove exactly why Protazanov fumbled this. Look at Grigory Chukrai's 1956 remake of this exact same story. Same title, The 41st. But this was the first major post-Stalinist film. It breaks the shackles of that rigid propagandist captivity. And it has sound. It has dialogue. Now, I argue that Chukrai's remake actually manages to handle the deep psychological nuance of that impossible finale that Protazanov completely fumbled, precisely because Protazanov was too busy filming endless expanses of sand instead of working out the psychology of his characters.
Wait, hold on. That is such a flawed argument. You are saying that because a film made 3 entire decades later, with the benefit of synchronized sound, with spoken dialogue to explain the feelings, with modern camera technology, and in a completely different, slightly more relaxed political climate, managed to add some psychological polish, that it somehow invalidates the raw, messy, instinctual power of the 1927 original. That is a completely unfair ahistorical comparison. Chukrai was reacting against the polished Stalinist propaganda that had become the norm. Protazanov was practically inventing the visual language of the Soviet epic while standing in a literal dust bowl with a wooden box camera.
I'm not saying the remake completely invalidates the original. I am saying it highlights exactly how dodgy and primitive the 1927 version's direction actually is when it comes to dealing with human beings rather than just epic landscapes. Protazanov was great at pointing a camera at the sand dune. He was terrible at charting the internal geography of a conflicted woman.
Which brings us perfectly, I think, to the absolute brawl we need to have over our primary source text for this entire discussion. Because sitting here listening to you, I feel like you are reading a completely different book than I am.
Oh, here we go. The sacred text. Let's open the good book.
Yes, the sacred text. Cinema, the Magic Vehicle. Journey 1, 1913 to 1950. Yeah. Look, the research in cinema, the magic vehicle, is spot on here. The authors argue that Protazanov was trying to build a completely new visual language. They call it a monumental achievement for a reason. He was fusing traditional theatricality with raw documentary realism because he had the stones to try something nobody else dared.
I reckon the book is being way too kind to him, to be honest. You call it ambition, I call it a massive ego trip. Just because a director spends a fortune and makes everyone miserable on set doesn't make him a genius. He was a proper narcissist with a camera, and I think the book lets him off the hook because it is a classic.
That is rubbish, mate. It's not an ego trip. It is an evolution. The book gives you the actual credits and the technical breakthroughs that changed how every film is made today. If you find the scale of it a bit of a slog, that's on you, not the history.
I'm just saying, I'm looking at it with a modern eye, and it's half brilliant and half nonsense. The book defends him through a historical lens, but I'm sitting here thinking, mate, cut 30 minutes out of that desert scene and we'd actually have a story. It is bloody bloated.
You cannot just edit history because it bores you for a few minutes. You can't just chop 30 minutes out of a masterpiece because you want to get to the action faster. The pacing reflects the psychological reality of the character's isolation. If they are stuck in the desert for weeks, the audience needs to feel a fraction of that exhausting time. It is deeply atmospheric.
It is not atmospheric, it is tedious. There's a fine line between making the audience feel the isolation and making the audience want to walk out of the cinema, and Protazanov crossed it.
Look, we are clearly, fundamentally, not going to see eye to eye on this. We are operating on entirely different frequencies when it comes to what makes cinema great. And frankly, to you listening right now, you know the score. We've done 40 of these explorations into historical texts and films, so you know full well we're never going to reach a perfect, neat little consensus where we wrap it up with a bow and agree to agree.
Thank God for that. I would die of boredom if I had to agree with your romanticized view of history every week.
Exactly. But here is the ultimate challenge for you, the listener. Because right now, you only have our two wildly diverging opinions. If you want to see if my esteemed colleague here is just being a cynical git who fundamentally lacks the patience to appreciate a foundational 1920s masterpiece, or if the book actually has it right, and this truly is a monumental achievement in the evolution of cinematic history, buy the thing. The link is in the description. Do you actually have the spine to read the real history, or are you staying a lazy enthusiast? Your call.
A lazy enthusiast. I like that. Accurate for most people, probably. It's much easier to just listen to us argue.
But before we leave you to make that choice, I want to leave you with one final lingering thought to mull over. Something that's been bothering me, scratching at the back of my mind underneath this entire hour-long argument. We've been fiercely debating whether this specific film's a masterpiece or a bloated mess, but zoom out and think about this. If a piece of art requires a dense historical textbook, if it requires you to understand 1920s Soviet montage theory, the Kuleshov effect, czarist theatrical traditions, the weight of orthochromatic cameras in the sand, and the political threat of bourgeois mentality just to explain why it is supposedly good, is it actually a masterpiece that stands the test of time? Or is it just a fascinating, dusty artifact trapped in a museum, only valuable because of the label next to it?
Well, now that, mate, is a bloody brilliant question.